Welcome, welcome, everybody. Thank you for your promptness. Also, I apologize that I was a little late letting you in. I was just, honestly, I was caught up in conversation with our wonderful panelists, and did not notice that we had passed our start time. So we're going to give it just a couple of minutes, to let a few other folks roll in. I think we're going to have an intimate crowd here tonight. And so I'm quite looking forward to just sitting in this virtual living room with these wonderful folks. I'm really excited. I'm really looking forward to it. If you want to introduce yourself in the chat, feel free. Feel free to say where you're tuning in from, or how you heard about the event, or what you're reading. Um, if you've been doing anything else for Freedom to Read Week, if you even knew Freedom to Read Week was a thing before this, um, feel free to just kind of introduce yourself if you like. I love to know who's here. I am Nick Brewer. I am currently the artistic programming director at the League, although I am leaving the League in March. Somebody else will be uh, kind of stepping into my role. And I think this panel is a great way to go out. I tried to organize this panel last week, not last week, last year. But I dropped the ball on actually organizing it. So I'm really grateful for Nicola, who's working with the League right now on a bunch of our events and cool artist stuff. I'm really grateful to Nicola for getting it together and really grateful to our panelists. From Alberta, where nothing bad happens to books ever. Thank you for joining us, Bonnie. Yeah, lots of the libraries are doing great work in Alberta right now. Fighting the good fight, that's for sure. All right. I think this may be everyone. So, and for the purpose of hearing from the interesting people more tonight, I'm just going to go ahead and dive right in and introduce myself, the event, and Freedom to Read Week, and your wonderful host and moderator. So I already said who I am. I don't need to say it again. Thank you all for joining us during our Freedom to Read Week panel. I am very, very excited to hear these wonderful panelists talk about the creative process, the realities of writing and publishing as two-spirit, indigiqueer, trans, and non-binary poets, and what it means to write against censorship and towards a queerer future. I can't wait to hear them. They're all geniuses. And Freedom to Read Week is celebrated in the States. They have Banned Books Week in September. That's got a catchier name, so it tends to get a bit more notice. In Canada, we have Freedom to Read Week, which was long run by the Book and Periodical Council and is now run by a combination of Library and Archives Canada, uh, the Ontario Library Association, and the initialism or the acronym is CULC, and it's something like the Council of University and College Libraries or something like that. So, three library powerhouse organizations work together to bring this celebration to libraries and schools all around Canada. And they also invite literary organizers and readers and just generally book people to discuss what censorship means, because it doesn't always just mean pulling books from shelves. It's so much more nuanced than that. And so that is why we have this panel here today, because part of that nuance is how are voices silenced when that doesn't necessarily look like pulling books from shelves, even though now it's pulling books from shelves again. I personally am tuning in from the Haldimand Tract, which is a stretch of land along the Grand River in Ontario, that traditionally, historically, and presently is under the care of the Six Nations of the Grand River. Six Nations are in active litigation against both Canada and Ontario to dispute land claims of the Haldimand Tract, and are constantly researching land transfers and land claims for land back and to continue the care of this land. If you would like to find out more about Six Nations, you can do so at their website, sixnations.ca. And I am very happy to introduce your host and moderator, Khashayar Mohammadi. Kess is a queer Iranian-born Toronto-based poet. Let me restart. Kess is a queer Iranian-born Toronto-based poet, writer, and translator. They are the winner of the 2021 Vallum Poetry Prize and the author of Book of Interruptions, out with Wolsak and Wynn. Their next full-length poetry manuscript is forthcoming with Ugly Duckling Presse. Please welcome Kess.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's a Thursday night. Thank you for spending your Thursday night with us. It's a great moment, afternoon, evening to spend with writing and speaking about freedom of thinking, freedom of writing, freedom of publishing. I am Khashayar Mohammadi. I go by Kess. And I am tuning in from Treaty 13, even though I crossed the treaty line to access internet today, so I'm not quite sure off my treaty where I stand right now. But tonight we're going to be presenting the Freedom to Read panel, and it centers joy, resistance, and the importance of queer voices in a landscape that you have all currently seen is becoming increasingly hostile. Many of you have mentioned in your messages today that we are undergoing a certain process. So I would like to first introduce our panel. After I introduce our panel, we're going to be going through a series of questions, and we're going to have some conversations. So our panel today is going to be a panel of Two-Spirit, Indigiqueer, trans, and non-binary poets, and that means that we are all writing against an increasing censorship that is happening as we speak. So, first of all, Ambrose Albert is a trans poet living on the traditional ceded and unsurrendered territory of the Wolastoqiyik people. His debut collection of poetry, Bec Call by Nightwood Editions 2018, won the New Brunswick Book Awards Fiddlehead Poetry Prize. Ambrose served a 2-year term as the City of Fredericton's Poet Laureate from 2019 to 2021. His chapbook, Growing Pains, is forthcoming with Anstruther Press in fall of 2026. He is currently working on a new collection of poetry as well as a novel about a trans man experiencing an immaculate pregnancy. Can't wait to hear more. Can't wait to read it. Everyone, welcome Ambrose.
Hey, everyone.
You can do your emojis and hands. Next up, we'd like to welcome Eli Taraq El-Beshelani Lynch, a mixed Arab writer and translator and co-publisher at Metonymy Press living in Chochage. Their book, Not Body, was published by Metatron Press in 2020. Their second book, The Good Arabs, published by Metonymy Press in 2022, was granted the honorary mention for poetry by the Arab American Book Awards, the Khairallah Prize honorary mention, and won the Grand Prix du Livre de Montréal with co-editor Samia Marshi. They edited El Ghuraba, an anthology of queer and trans writing by Arab and Arabophone writers, published by Metonymy Press in June 2024. Welcome, Eli Taraq.
Hi, thank you.
Our third panelist is Jay Simpson, an OG Cree Soto Indigiqueer from the Zapotewayak Cree Nation. Simpson is a writer, advocate, and activist sharing their knowledge and lived experiences in hopes of creating a utopia. Their first poetry connection, It Was Never Going to Be Okay, by Nightwood Editions 2021, was shortlisted for the 2021 Relit Award and the Writers' Trust of Canada Dane Olivier Prize, and won the 2021 Indigenous Voices Award for published poetry in English. Without further ado, everybody, welcome our panel. Welcome, Jay. So, as you know, we're going to be talking about basically a lot of difficult things. So I want to start with a little icebreaker, something to get us warmed up, something to get us going. So I will turn to each of you one by one, starting from Ambrose, and I'm going to ask you, what is a word that you feel like you need to use all the time, but you're tired of? And what is a word that you want to use all the time, but don't often, it doesn't often fit? So let's start with Ambrose.
I love this. I think I'll start with the ones that I want more occasion to use. I think for anyone that's gone through like the MA or MFA pipeline for creative writing, there's those words we're told to avoid or not use too frequently. So I wrote down yearn and moon as two of the ones that I feel like let's just use them as much as we want. Why do we have these rules around certain words? There's a Chen Chen poem where moon is used countless times, and it's just one of the ones I go to that I'm like, of course, we love the moon. Like, why are we depriving ourselves of enjoying it and using that word? And then I couldn't think of any specific examples, but whenever I'm writing, there's always those words that pop up that you don't want to have to lean on. That you're like, no, I just wish I could express this without needing that word to get the concept across. I'm thinking kind of like because or things like that, where it feels like I'm almost over explaining. So it's words like that I'm like, no, I don't want you. You're cluttering the poem. Make more room for the moon, I guess.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn the same questions, exact same question to Eli Tyrek.
I was trying to think about this a bunch before, being like, what word do I not want to use? Or what words do I like overuse? And I think it depends, like it's always like dependent on the project. Like some projects, like when I wrote my first book, Not Body, I was like, how many times can I say body? Like God. Just kind of like sick of it both for myself and like for the perceived reader. I was like, okay, we need to figure out different ways of like articulating this. And at some point, it's just useful, and so you let it happen. Um, but also, I feel like the words you chose, Ambrose, are very queer. You're like yearning and the moon. I was like, really, it was just like homophobia in the MFA, being like, don't use those words. Um, yeah, I'm not sure. Like, I don't have words that I'm also particularly drawn to using, like that I want to use more. Um, I think that I guess I'm like kind of similarly to Ambrose. I'm like always striving to find new ways to say things that aren't over explaining and that kind of lean into the mood or the energy or the kind of flow of what I'm trying to say and how to move out of the space of over explaining as a poet. I feel like that's my constant thing. So I'm just like, um, yeah, trying to use the thesaurus more also.
And Jay, let's see if you have any words for us.
Yeah, I with my two collections of poetry, I have had to do a lot of edits because Yearning, of course, is way up there. I think in my second collection I have a poem called Queer Icarus Yearns Too Close to the Sun. So I've been in MFA or whatever. I love the fact that I'm uneducated. Because it reminds me of that scene where it's like, y'all got paid. That meme. Y'all got paid. Um, I I have been finding myself writing in words that I try to find more accessible for my family members that live a couple blocks away from me on the street. So I'm trying to write in a more accessible way. I fear I've gotten a bit artsy with it. So I've been saying I have been found wanting a lot. So I've been found wanting constantly. And I love the word relentlessly and despite, which I think speaks to resistance and remain. I've tried to get rid of the word privy from my writing because I use it. I'm much too privy to the word privy. And it's a bit abundant and she's got to go. She's got to go. She's got to go. She's gotten her time in the sun, and it's, you know what, it is what it is. And we put our cliches in little bows and we put them in the mail.
Okay, that's part one. Part two, which is a little bit, more serious, but also, something quick that, will ease us into the meat of the question is, what is a book that was required reading for you that you found superfluous? And what is a book that you wish was required reading for you? Like, what was a book that you found later in life and was like, I wish I had read this younger? And what was a book that you didn't care much for, but, it was sanctioned for you to read? So let's start with Ambrose.
So this one's probably timely with the new movie. But Wuthering Heights, and I don't feel like I gave it a fair shake. I'll admit, I was in one of those like excelled reader programs in middle school, and they were like, "Well, now you should read Wuthering Heights." And I think I just got jaded trying to read it and could not enjoy it. And yeah, I just could not enjoy Wuthering Heights. And I recognize why people probably enjoy it, but just was not for me. As I'm sure the new movie probably will not be my taste either. How do you ruin Wuthering Heights? Like, it's not like I like it, but I know the source material at least gave you something to work with. But the one I wish I had read sooner, one that came to mind, I've taught Intro to Creative Writing a few times, and Chen Chen's collection, Your Emergency Contact Needs an Emergency Contact, I think is the title. It was just a collection of poetry that was so, it wasn't pretentious. It wasn't trying to alienate the audience. It was contemporary and felt like I could identify with Chen Chen when I was reading it. And the poems were fun. I found like so much of the poetry I read in academic settings, even before university, were like trying to make me into something I wasn't. And when I kind of started reading poetry that I wanted to read without, having it pushed at me, like Chen Chen stuff was what really stuck out. And seeing my students fall in love with poetry was really nice too. Like when they read a poem that's like, oh, I get this. I might not get one of Shakespeare's sonnets, but I can absolutely identify with what I'm reading from this poet who's writing and living in the world right now. Not to shit on Shakespeare, but I think we can enjoy writers who are writing at this current moment too.
I'm gonna pass the same question to like to hire.
I don't know if there's anything in particular that I regret reading, or that was like, I mean, when we were talking about Wuthering Heights, I was like, well, I find Jane Eyre even worse. Like that one was like pretty rough, and like the love interest is horrible. And I was like, and is just an angry man who kept his wife in his attic. Like, why? Why was that what I was reading when I was 12? But there are things about Jane Eyre that clearly like spoke to me at the time. But one writer who I actually haven't read and I actually was glad I hadn't read is Virginia Woolf, because for a long time, I felt like, oh, she's like the quote unquote, I feel like people treat her like as like the important woman writer to read, as like a feminist, etc., blah blah blah. But she was a horrific racist, and like I tried to read a book of hers that I had in my bookshelf. I forget which one it was, but like the first scene was so anti-black and so horrifying, and I was like, what the fuck? Like, people are reading this? Like, people like this woman? And I was like, you know what? Maybe young me realized ahead of time, like knew it was bad news. And so I feel like she's someone who I'm like, I'm glad I didn't read. Um, and someone who I wish I read earlier is Rabia Alameddin, who's this he's like a gay Lebanese novelist, and he writes about um a bunch of things, but like his first novel is called Kool-Aids, and it takes place between like a young person in Lebanon during the Civil War, and then a few gay men during the HIV and AIDS crisis in San Francisco. And it kind of like goes back and forth, and it's like really extremely experimental, very fun. It has like passages that are just like a series of conversations between the most random people, like Eleanor Roosevelt, Tom Cruise. There was like a Hindu goddess whose name I'm forgetting, like just this like random like conversation that comes in the middle of the book and then leaves, but then later on comes back. And I just feel like he is so fun and playful. And he wrote this book called An Unnecessary Woman, which was like I think his third book. And it is one of the best books I've read. I feel like he did something with the narrative that worked so well. And the whole story is just about this older woman in Lebanon who lives in a small apartment, and she translates a book every year into either Arabic, French, or English, or often Arabic, but she only translates from languages she knows. So sometimes she'll translate a book that's been translated again, and she just does it for herself. Like she like every year translates a book. That's her project. um and then you kind of get like her backstory and her life. And I was like, wow, he made me committed to this woman's life, who's kind of like not really a very obvious kind of protagonist, like not an obviously exciting protagonist, but actually he makes so much with her life, that I'm like, An Unnecessary Woman is a book that I would recommend to people who want to know how to write a novel. It's great.
Well, I hope this section brings a few recommendations for all of us. I will definitely be writing down your books, and I'm glad to have read Chen Chen, but I will pick up uh, Rabia Alameddin, and I'm going to send the same question to Jay.
Thank you. I didn't much care for The Outsiders. I wish that they were more gay, and they aren't, and the author is a homophobe. I just wanted them to make out, and maybe experiment and touch themselves, and touch each other. Um, when we're in high school, when we're reading these books, we're kind of being like hoping for the perverse because it's so repressed, especially as queer people. And the fact that I wanted Ponyboy to keep it warm in his mouth was a bit wild, but yeah. Bro, are you seeing this too? Holy hell. Um, I'm gonna pass out. Um, for me, as I've gotten really into queer horror, it's just a genre that is so unexpected for me, which it surprises me because I read a lot of poetry, but queer horror is actually what just made me fall in love with reading again. I love horror movies, so I don't know why it's quite the jump, but something about Chuck Tingle's writing is so satirical, but a little bit too on the nose. He's got this one novel called Camp Damascus, which is about conversion camp, and it has a twist that is quite surprising, that mixes science and magic. And then he's got this novel called Kill Your Gaze, which is about the Hollywood scene and AI and the perverse nature of AI and queerness. And there's, I've been really loving retellings, because especially queer retellings and fairy tales and monstrous fairy tales. There's this novel called Starving Saints by Caitlin Strong, I think, which is like, it ends in a thruple, and it's like got like, it's I think queer horror is just really giving me everything I wanted. I just finished AJ White's You Weren't Meant to Be Human, which is about a trans man who's carrying a child. And I think I think that's one of the joys of being able to read what you want, when you want, how you want it, and being given the option to explore. Like my favorite in grade 11 and 12, my favorite English classes were when we got to pick our own novel to write about and talk about. And so queer horror to me is the most liberating, because it's becoming less fiction and more reality as the days go on. So that's some things I've been having some fun with.
So basically, I'm going to be taking things that you have all said within the first and second session, because it very much feeds into the third question, which is about craft. So we have both. So I myself, I have never studied poetry. So, and as we heard Ambrose speak about the MA, MFA route, and as we heard about Jay, and being very much so against that education and what it imposes on a person. So I want to ask you all about craft, because craft is a very specific way that canons, and by their, as a result, all the oppressive elements of the canon, of colonialism, patriarchy, feed into how we write. I want to ask each of you how you locate yourself in relationship to perceived canons. And when I say perceived canons, I want you to choose the canon that you locate yourself within. I'm not saying how do you locate yourself within, for example, canlit, this, that lit, queer lit. I want you to speak to me about canons and how you relate to it on different levels, what you choose, what you refute. So I'm going to turn to Ambrose first again.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think about that question, because again, going that academic route, like we learn so much about, like, oh, these are the big Canadian writers that you should know and study and be familiar with. And maybe it's just where I'm situated in my identity, but I never felt like I quite fit within any of those boxes. It it was hard to find writers that I felt like came from similar experiences as I had. And I think when I stopped kind of idolizing canon, if that makes sense, like looking at some of these writers, I think part of the disillusionment came with some of the bigger shifts in canlit, in particular, where we saw, some of the names that we really idolized getting revealed to be not great people, if not outright predatory, particularly to young writers, where I think I started viewing poetry less as this larger canon and more as something that can exist personally and communally. And that's kind of how I perceive myself kind of moving in it now. And recognizing, community can be complicated, and not all of us align, but it's something I find, sometimes we're pushed into certain boxes, and just that is something I try to be conscious of and recognize, like, again, we're not all a monolith. So sometimes I think when we canonize people as like, oh, this is quintessential Canadian lit or queer lit, even, like, we have so many varied experiences that I think there's beauty in having those stories told without it being kind of described as, oh, it's all kind of in this category. Like, my poetry is so different from Jay's and Eli Turak's and yours, Kess, that I think there's something beautiful in the uniqueness of all these different voices versus like kind of this monolith of canon lurking over us, if that makes sense.
So here, I I don't want to insert myself too much, but here's something that I, for example, like, uh, I moved to Toronto in my late teens, and seeking a queer culture where previously there wasn't much for me back home. I mean, it existed, but I didn't have access to it because, anyway, long story. But in the beginning, you're like queers, queers, and then after a while, you're like, just because we're all queer doesn't mean we're on the same wavelength. We just
Absolutely.
you can be also very
Screw some of those other queer writers. Not gonna lie, screw them.
and you're like, some of
The
you,
fun way, not in the fun way.
you're like, oh, some of you can be for anyway. We can, again, we have a lot of like you said. Uh, anyway, sorry, I'm gonna pass the question to Tarek, and what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna actually reframe a part of my question because I think maybe I was a little bit unclear. Yes, there's the idea of the canon, but I also really want to speak about craft because uh, we do develop a certain way of writing, and that way of writing has ways of interacting with communities that we have. And I was wondering if we could basically speak about that a little bit as well.
Yeah, I like to think about this less as like canon, not because I like think that the word is not appropriate, but more for myself, like I think about like lineages. And like for me, I really love to think about the ways that we write as like parts of lineage that have existed before us and ideally will exist past us, right? And like I love history and I love looking into like what has happened in order to understand like what is happening now, right? And that applies as much for me to like the ways that the world functions as much as it applies in like to craft, for example, and like seeing the ways that like if you look at the different kind of literary movements, seeing the ways that like what was happening politically affected people, why people were interested in writing in this specific way. Like I'm like really interested in being like, oh, well, they wrote in the way that they speak because before that, people wrote in a more like fancy way or whatever. And like you wanted to differentiate the spoken word from the literary, right? And that's kind of more broadly, but like for me, when I did go to university, but I just did like an undergrad in creative writing. Um, and in your undergrad, you have less kind of like ability to look into what you want to do yourself because a lot of it is like assigned to you. So I did this sort of like mini thesis that you can do, like an independent study, which is like made to kind of prepare you for your master's, but I just did it because I was like, I want the freedom to choose who I'm reading and what I'm doing. And I specifically that year, like this was, 10 years ago, I was 21. And I was like, I'm only going to read racialized writers and queer writers. And even more so queer racialized writers. I was like, I want to change who I'm reading and what I'm thinking about and like how I'm thinking about craft, right? And for me, like I was like, I don't need to read what's his face? I'm forgetting his name. He's like a big American writer. Um uh anyways, it doesn't really matter. because Danez Smith read that person and loves that person, and I really like Danez Smith's work, and so I'm getting imbued with the thing that Danez Smith loved about that other writer through that lineage, right? And I'm at a point where I'm like, well, I want to read Danez Smith. I don't need to read the person before them. I don't need to read people in the like American or Canadian canon that I don't give a shit about, right? Um, and I can kind of read in the contemporary who I want to be reading, you know? Like I think that we forget that writers do bring their own lineages, right? We got to this point kind of all together or, you know, in different bunches or whatever you want to call it. But we're at this point because of the history of writing that has come before us, right? And so I think for me, that's been one thing. And then the other thing is kind of looking into like histories of Arab writing and like kind of themes and like thoughts and like um looking into that and like that's mostly been through translation because my reading level in Arabic is like of a fourth grader or fifth grader, and so I'm not reading novels necessarily, but I'm also reading like other diasporic Arab writers who are connected in some way, who are bringing their own ideas, right? So, like for example, I'm going to bring back Rabia Alamuddin because I do feel like he is part of my like writing lineage. I recognize something in his work that speaks to me. Um, he wrote a book called Hakawati, which is about the character of a Hakawati, which is the storyteller, and is, you know, like it was a role in different tribes and different communities. You'd have a storyteller all the time. And so he wrote about that role of the Hakawati as it started being less present in contemporary culture. And he did that through A Thousand and One Nights in his own recreation, right? And I was like, well, that's a lineage. It's a kind of obvious one because that's a text we know in the West, but there's something interesting in doing that kind of research for myself and like figuring out how that other people's craft like speaks shapes my own craft, I guess. Hopefully that wasn't too all over the place, but
Actually, that brought me to something. So I'm liking how this is developing through the panel because now when I bring it to Jay, I want to ask, through this, we are developing not only hyphenated writings, we are bringing different aspects of our identities. We are different things. And a lot of the times we are being our queerness, our uh, ethnicities, our lineages. So I want to ask basically everything that has been said. Do you, Jay, do you also consider yourself a fan of all these because especially when you said, you said you like queer horror, and that is something new and exciting because we're getting these new combinations of the things that we like. I'm gonna bring the question down to you whether if you want to uh, uh, guide the question of craft down uh, these mixtures of identity.
Well, there's nothing new about queer horror. Like horror has been inherently queer since its beginning. Um, and I think about like, as an Indigenous trans woman, oral storytelling has been a part of our language and our way of keeping stories. And what, like, horror stories or stories been told to warn children about the things that knock at night, have been told by the story keepers who predominantly have been two-spirit and queer. So inherently, if the story is from a queer mouth, isn't it queer, even if it doesn't address queerness? And there's nothing more scary than a queer body in the mainstream. And that's some things I think about. For me, I don't care about the canon. For one point in my life, I cared about the canon so much because there were so few Indigenous trans women in it. But now I'm at this point where the canon is just a fork and a knife and a plate on how you are consumed and how palatable you are. And I, for one, do not care about being consumed. If there's no one listening to my story, that in itself is sad, but that'll never happen because we're all so curious for each other. And to me, that's what I'm focused on. And I really like what Eli said about lineages. As an Indigenous person, we have to communicate where we came from. We have to know where we came from. We have to know where our kin are. And so for me, I do say my literary kin is like Billy Ray Belcourt, Joshua Whitehead, Ariel Twist, Leanne Simpson, Eden Robinson. There's these Indigenous writers that I am so close to, that I read their books and I know their story, and I know I have friendships with them. But because of that, I am so inspired, and I do write sometimes like them. Like I've got a poem that someone reviewed online, was like, it sounds like a Billy Ray Belcourt poem. No wonder he edited it. And someone said that I had lost my voice, and that's craft as well. But also, I'm like, but like as a native trans woman, I feel like I'm a shapeshifter. That's something that's culturally important to me as a writer as well, is that I can shift and become intangible and transfigure myself and adapt. But also, a lot of us who are queer and trans, we are shapeshifters. We are transfiguring our flesh and our body and our mind to betray this forced idea of what we were told we could and couldn't be. And to me, that's a form of ascension. And ascension to me is the opposite, and the antithesis of canon. And I would rather aim for ascension and utopia than canon and mainstream. And of course, there's safety in mainstream, but also mainstream are those girly pops who shop at Indigo and they go to the Giller, and they say nothing about Palestine, or like, the Congo, and they don't talk about ICE, they don't talk about migration, which is which is a natural thing that happens. It's a very natural thing that happens. And so I think canon is mainstream in a way that I steer away from that level of mundanity, and I would prefer ascension. And I always say my craft is about destroying fences and building longer tables, and that's what I want my writing to also do. Yeah.
I think one thing that I just want to make this clear, which is that these questions of craft are ones of how we make our space, because we've never been allowed into such craft. And that's how, a lot of us, deviate from it. And what you said, Jay, it just kindles so much energy within us, because we realize that, our voices, like you said, we are so thirsty for each other because we want to listen to each other, and we write for each other, and we like each other, and then our books get taken and said, oh, there are too many iterations of the word moon, and this is not a good product, therefore this is not a good product for this shelf. It's not a And what I was going to say is that it's actually in the questions, which I'm going to a little bit jump, because this question perfectly connects, and I want to actually continue with you, Jay, this time, because we're speaking about it. Is that how does the current cultural moment shape how you are perceived in relationship to how you as a person perceive yourself? Because like you said, we are bought and sold. There are all these knives and forks in us. And I want to ask you, how do you feel you are being perceived against how you want to be perceived? Because that plays into a lot of these freedoms that we're speaking about.
Yeah, I don't put much weight in how I want to be perceived. That'll never happen. That is a reality that just won't exist. I'm far too antagonistic and far too much a destruction of the norm. I allegedly threw red paint at Scotiabank and went to jail for Palestine. I did spend some time in jail for it, and I would do it again. Well, limited because I've got implants now, but safety. But I think for me, I don't care how I'm perceived, and I think that's what makes me more dangerous. Because the stakes aren't there. Once upon a time, when I believed in the canon, I believed in those stakes. is when I was like believing in respectability politics, but that's so racist to believe in respectability politics. To be the perfect minority, to be the model citizen is such a lie that we're forced down to be containable. And for one, I enter a room and I know folks shiver and I don't care. Is it transmisogynistic that they're so scared of the scary native trans woman? Yes, for sure, but that's their own thing to deal with. That's not going to stop me from sitting down and saying my piece and doing what I need to do and the work that needs to be done. I'm there for a reason, and it's not for them. If they try to stop me from entering the room, then I don't even want to be in that room. I don't care for it. If they were to enter a room in which I am in and sit at my table, they can sit at the table, but they're going to have to hear what I have to say. And I think that's the freedom of being able to speak and this idea of censorship. And, we're only going to let in these trans people. We're only going to let in these native people. We're only going to let in these ones who agree with what we say. Isn't that a form of fascism? Isn't that literally a form of fascism to try to create this bias and oneness and sameness? I think there needs to be disagreement. I think there needs to be, for me, an argument is not conflict. A disagreement is not conflict. Conflict has been so misused in community and in society that is causing so much infighting that we cannot get past it to work together to unify. And that is a big thing that, I'm very boots on the ground kind of girl. I'm always at the front lines. I'm always, stirring up some sort of ruckus. But there's always that conversation on that's not how we should do it. And I'm sorry to say, but a diversity of tactics has always been the way. It's always been how we get things done. And I think I'm so happy to have moved past this idea of what I think I am. I know that I am the life of the party. I know I'm the charismatic one. I know I'm the snappy one. I know I'm the funny one, but I know I'm the one that gets things done. And I never said I was nice. I always said I was kind.
I'm going to take a moment to just say these all play into. Sorry, actually, before I say much, I just want to hear, because we don't have much time. I just want to hear everyone speak, and maybe in the end I will have some. So I want to, let's go the other way, and I want to say, Eli, Eric, if you have anything to say within what, whether or not you also feel disinterested in how, because we've all gone through this process of saying this gaze that is on us, we are very disinterested in this gaze, but it, however, is perceiving us in certain ways. And I was wondering if I can pass that to you and whether you would like to speak on it for some time.
Yeah, I really like everything that you're saying, Jay, and I was like smiling and laughing through it because I was like, I hear you. And like I see that in you, and um, I like relate to some of the things a lot because I'm like not gonna shut my mouth, and I'm like I've been political for a long time. It didn't just start in October 2023 for me. Like I think there's like this thing of like um I guess for me like the thing that I want people to perceive me as is someone who's gonna do what they want to do and someone who cares about community and someone who is political, like that, those things feel important to me. Like, I think if people don't think that about me, then I don't know. I mean, if I'm not doing the things, whatever. So this my loop doesn't make sense, but I'm like, I think I care more about what I think about me than I care about what other people think about me, Like, I'm like, at this point, I'm like, I love being an artist. I love being a writer. I love performing. I love being in writing community, different kinds of writing communities. And I also am always going to say what I think and how I feel. And I'm always going to like, I don't know, like, I think I'm just thinking about like within the writing community and like what the things that, um, you were saying, Jay, like brought up for me, and like what I've been thinking about for the past couple years in terms of like what it looks like to be in this space. And maybe part of this is going to go off off the question, but I think that for me, I've been like extremely happy to see when people show up and do shit, and extremely disappointed in so much of the complicity in the writing community and the ways that Canadian lit functions within a very um like passive, very Canadian, very white, very sort of like complicit way, and how like being a political writer makes you stand out because there's so many people who are not willing to stand up. And I think that I think people's perception of me is often like the loud person or the person who's going to be political. And I think that's true, but I think that that would be less the case if more of us were like that, I think, right? Like I think that sometimes it feels like an anomaly for like someone to be like, I fuck Amazon, fuck their money and their book prizes, fuck Indigo, fuck Margaret Atwood, fuck and her stupid massive book, fuck like all these things within like writing institutions that have like sort of been the like capitalist backbone of Canadian book production. Fuck Penguin Random House, honestly, and the fact that they've eaten every single small press. Like, I don't know. Anyways, maybe I'm perceived as angry. I am. Um, but I think I'm just kind of like, shit needs to change in this space. And like, what happened to the idea of writers as political? Like, when did we become just another like capitalist, like cog in the machine? Like, I hate that. And so that's my little rant.
Sorry, I'm just going to address something very quick, which is that we are nearing the proposed time, but if everyone is okay to stand, we would like to speak more, so we don't want to cut ourselves out at this point. We are just getting going, so if everyone is okay with staying, we can stay a little bit longer. And what I was gonna say is actually, before I get to Ambrose, I'm gonna say something very quick to you, Eli Tarek, which is that we also see that because of institutions like Indigo and Amazon, and because of the great capitalist machinery, a lot of the rules that we deal with on a day-to-day basis are so sometimes, like for example, let's say, as Jay was speaking, there's this lineage, there's this 5 or 6 people that are inspiring each other, reading each other, exploring each other's work. And for example, if they want to write a review for each other, if they want to write an essay on each other, they're all attacked by these things of like, oh, it's not objective, it's not this, it's not that. And these all come from the advent of capitalism, where, NYRB is telling or like London Review of Books is telling their authors that, because your book review goes out to 50,000 people, and because these books have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of books published, you need to be objective, which they never are, first of all. But then we who want to write about our kin, about our people who are within our culture, people who are very much so within our traditions, that we barely can find. We are 10, and that when we want to write about each other, we are being told we cannot because we are not objective. I just wanted to bring that up because I think it connects very well to what you said, but I would also like to pass that down to Ambrose because I would love to know uh, what Ambrose has to say.
Sorry, I'm on hotel Wi-Fi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yes, yes.
Awesome.
It's been a trying Wi-Fi day for all of us.
It has been. I think just going off some of what Jay and Eli Trek were saying, I've I've been in literary spaces. I've seen the ways our voices have been censored, or have had to be advocated for and fought for to be included. Um, I was Fredericton's poet laureate for a few years, and I'm a white dude, and I was getting pushback for sharing a poem from a local Black poet on the Black Lives Matter movement, for reading a poem about abortion access in City Hall. And, people were calling for, let's put an end to the poet laureate role. And that's what they were considering like a palatable white person. So I can only imagine what people from other intersections would experience in those spaces if a white dude was running up against those barriers. Um, and same in the publishing sphere. I've been on juries or read for magazines or publishers, and sometimes going with the status quo, going with this older white writer who is going to be a guaranteed bestseller, versus going with a new voice that's young or queer or racialized. Like it's so frustrating to see how so many of the systems in place are working against us. Like, and that just ties right into Freedom to Read Week. Like, we're seeing queer books get pulled off the shelf because they're afraid a kid's going to read what my queer poetry and decide they want top surgery. Like, I want nothing more than a queer kid to pick up one of our poetry books and see themselves in it, or see something in those words that makes them feel like they have community or that they're supported. And it's on so many levels. Like, we're literally seeing trans people have their rights taken away. We're seeing books taken off the shelf. We're seeing people's driver's licenses being confiscated in Kansas potentially. And it's like the act of writing. I think there was a time where I worried about what an audience might think of me, or approached like being a poet as kind of, RuPaul's best friend race. And as I've gotten further in my career and really been in community with the writers I admire, it's taught me a lot about, you have a platform, and there is a risk to speaking up, to speaking what your experiences are, to pushing back against things that you fundamentally disagree with. Like, we're seeing writers that are boycotting big book prizes like the Giller, who they're going to experience some setbacks likely with publishers when it comes down the road. Because what do those publishers want? To be able to slap a sticker on that says, this is a big prize winning book. But that's, a cost that I think I can live with. Same as maybe not being welcome in every room. Like, I don't regret being the poet laureate that, caused shit. I think that's a legacy I'm comfortable with. And yeah, just those are some of my thoughts.
One thing I would say is that we've come to a point where we're all realizing through some, so so far these were the very simple questions, but what has happened is that we have all realized that, and this is something that runs through everything that all of you have said so far, and something that we've all felt, is that we are living within police states that are, the violence is not just towards action, it is also towards our anger. When no matter how much oppression we are under, no matter how much violence has been around us and we have experienced, we are not allowed to show any modicum of a response, because the only except, as we said, with respectability politics, with how we're perceived, we're being loud, saying things, not getting a book deal later. All these play into the system where the only person that perseveres through all this is the only person who has not said anything. because any sort of any statement shrinks that radius. Any statement, even if it's, I'm sorry, any statement shrinks that radius, and we're rubbing against a system that is policing our very anger, because we have gone through this history of violence, and we are not even allowed to say the most palatable things about it, let alone what a lot of you are saying, which is with the very power in your guts, where you are saying the most powerful things about what is happening. And it's frankly faint making to be in this space with all of you. So Ambrose was already speaking about this. I'm going to let them speak a little bit more about it, and then I'll go through the rest, which is that we finally get to it, the freedom to read. Freedom to read week. What is actually at stake? We've spoken a lot about what's at stake, but let's speak like as writers, as poets, as community members. We don't, what is at stake for us, and what role do we play? And I'm going to start with Ambrose because they've already been speaking. He's already been speaking about it, but we'll go through.
Yeah, I think there's so many roles we play as poets, and for a lot of us here in this room, also, activists and people living within our community. As writers, we're refusing to make our words more palatable or fit a certain narrative, and choosing to write, like being trans or non-binary, two-spirit, writing our experiences is a radical act. It is speaking again, like Eli Trek and Jay said so eloquently, like there's lineages there. It's not like it's a new thing. It's something we're carrying forward, and hopefully a whole new generation will get those narratives and be able to share their own and be a part of that. It's also, pushing back in the spaces that we are given those opportunities in, on juries, at publishers, at literary magazines. And in some cases, like I found, it's making your own space. And that's also a lot of labor that we're often expected to do. But if they're not going to let us in, we'll create our own spaces, whether it's a lit mag or a publisher, or hand printing poetry on our home printers and handing it out at readings. I think also, like, we're seeing an age now where, like, it's not like poets have never been political, that we've always been described as political. There's countless quotes, not that I like Percy B. Shelley. I call him Percy Bitch Shelley. Poets are the legislators of the world. And it's, we've been writing forever. And to think that there could be parts of our history, of our lineages, of our lives erased solely because they're afraid it could be read by someone who might feel seen in it. It's more hats than I thought. When I started writing poetry, I used it kind of as a means of therapy, of expressing my emotions, and it's become so much more. It's become an act of community care. It's more than just writing words on a page or reading. It's become, again, yeah, that act of community care is how it's felt.
And what I'm again going to go back in, that when you say we can start initiatives, get communities together, but then the the response that we get is that, for example, we are shunned from all these places, shoved out of all these rooms for speaking out, and then we create a space where we can publish our 5 good friends, and then people are saying, why are you creating this place and only doing your friends? And we're saying, well, because you didn't let us in. And also, this whole idea of transparency only matters within that capitalist system. You only have to be transparent where, you are selling tens of thousands, like 50,000, 100,000 books. When it's putting 5 chapbooks, stapling them together and bringing them to a reader, you can just be like, I'm only doing this for me and my best friend, and I will do it every day. Also, one thing I realized I left off of that question is that I'm going to turn it to you again, Ambrose, and maybe you can say something small about it, which is that, is there something you feel is missing from the idea of freedom that you would like to add when you say we need this freedom of to read? Do you think something is missing from that freedom, from that concept of freedom, from what is commonplace?
I know it's a little off the freedom to read explicitly, but freedom to write and play and experiment. I think sometimes we, especially in my case, like we're taught to write a poem a certain way or to do our craft in these explicit measures. And I found so much freedom in playing with that notion, doing different things on the page, exploring oral storytelling instead. Like I like to be a rule breaker, and I think poetry is such an incredible craft for that, and to just experiment. And maybe again, like I loved what Jay was saying about shape shifting. Like I have the ability, like I have top surgery tomorrow. I have the ability to express myself in that way, and if the box isn't fitting, I'm not going to write, like again, not having to avoid certain words, or certain topics. Like I think it's important that we're able to write about the world around us, to talk about what's going on in Palestine and Sudan and the Congo, and what's happening across the border in the US and right here in Canada, in Alberta. And in New Brunswick, our previous premier had policy 713, where we're running up against this everywhere. And I think as poets, sometimes we're expected to write about, flowers, things that are pastoral or pretty. And I think we need to have that freedom to write politically and to write about our lives. And again, write for our communities.
I have a few personal questions for you, but I'm going to run the same question about freedom to read and freedom in the broader sense to Jay and Eli before I get to specific questions that I have done for each of you. So I would like to ask Jay, if you, first of all, again, like just, it's been a while since I asked the question. So first of all, like, what do you think is at stake with the freedom to read for writers, community members? And also, is there something you feel personally is missing from the idea of this freedom, this concept of freedom?
Well, I would have to say that I think this has all been, and not to give them much credit, I think this has been a plan for a long time. The conservative agenda has been to build a platform on miseducation. When we look at the censorship of books, it's not getting the largest outcry because reading is not being put a lot of weight in. When we look at the literacy rates in our communities, they're so low, especially as an urban Indigenous woman. The literacy rate for Indigenous people is so low because there's so little funding. There's so little resources to help folks interact with these kind of works. So the literacy rates are super low, so that when books get banned, they don't particularly care because it doesn't really impact them. My own mom could barely read. And so when I think about it, there's so much at stake because our access to information is at stake. And when we cannot access this kind of information, we cannot develop our own ideas. We cannot develop our own thoughts, our own opinions, our own biases, especially if it's not a wide, diverse field of information where we are then like putting our own morals and ethics into the lenses, into the nuances at play. And so for me, what's at stake is a huge, huge, huge ability of independent thought autonomy. And so for me, what's at stake is the ability for not only representation, but for active thinkers who can change and bend and break things, which we really need now more than ever. And, I feel like there's been a lot of suppression. And also at the same time, I think there needs to be um, moves and counter moves. We're playing a game of chess and we're kind of in the final bits of it. And so for me, I've been telling folks, I'm like, what would be really beneficial is if we even adapted some of these books that have been banned, try to make them a little bit more digestible, make them consumable to other people, different ages, create more translations, diversify the banned books and recreate them in ways that can be consumed, because then what that'll do is that'll disperse the information which we need now more than ever. And I think a lot about one of my elders, C. Weiss. She calls it seed bombing, and she'll go around the neighborhood and she'll make seed bombs of indigenous seeds, and she'll just throw them into an empty bed, and then when it rains and stuff like that, those seeds will come, they'll germinate, and then they'll create an urban but indigenous garden. I think we need to start doing that with literature. We need to start sharing little pieces and snippets, and Instagram posts and stuff like that. That works for a little bit, but I think wheat pasting on the street, and we start bringing these kind of things forward, I think is one way to help navigate this, because what's at stake is our ability to pursue, and I think that's really scary. And to know that, like, the whole idea of censoring books is just really despicable to me, and I feel qualms about it, because there are books that I think should not be on shelves, which is the nuanced thing. There's a lot of dangerous rhetoric books out there that are based on bias and not fact, especially towards trans folks. There's a lot of turfy books out there being platformed. And so I'm out here weighing it, being like, let's not censor, but then also maybe let's create conversations about them. If you're going to pick up this book, maybe also pick up this book, maybe pick up this book. Like, there are conversations to be had. The whole idea of banning books, if there's one thing about the human nature, you cannot suppress or resist something for too long. It's not going to work. It's never worked. We have not seen anything like that ever work. The fact that I'm here is proof that the genocide of my people didn't work, right? So the suppression of books isn't going to work, but what we can do is we can try to mitigate the erasure of this diverse population of information that has been so freely gifted. So yeah.
Before passing it to Eli Chark, I want to say it also plays into some things that you said, which was about how were people interacting politically with their times. Like, for example, when you look into different lineages, different movements of writing. So I wanted to same question to you about freedom to read and what's at stake, but also, like, maybe you could expand onto maybe a little bit about what you previously said about political moments and how they actually create seeds of creativity within political moments.
Yeah, I definitely, because I was already going to connect them, so that's perfect. Because I'm just thinking, like, I've been talking a lot about like basically the past 2 years, I think, has been like a political and activist education in a way that I didn't perceive happening, but that has been like pretty life-changing, I would say. Um, in the sense that, like, I've always been quite politically active, and the past 2 years has pushed me into a new kind of space of activism. Um, and in that activism, I've been talking to a lot of like activist friends about kind of like how we imagine the future, how we imagine like what's going on in the world, how we imagine creating change. And for me, so much of that imagining is also looking back and seeing how people have done things historically, right? Um, and to make the connection with the freedom to read, I think that like the freedom to access those knowledges, whether they're a history book or a book, a memoir or a poem or whatever it is, the our ability to access those things, it can be life changing, you know? Like I think for me, I was looking a lot into apartheid South Africa and thinking through like what happened there, how did it look like? Um, in the past few years and thinking through kind of different ways of being and different ways that that people have created change, right? And so I think that for me, like it's important not to like I as a book lover, I'm like, of course it's important not to ban books, but I think there's even more that like Jay was touching upon as well, which is that when you have that access to information, when you have access to stories, when you have access to things that will move you, whether it's intellectually or emotionally or both, you know, like those things can be life changing. Those things can um, give you the knowledge that it takes to be more critical, to be aware of what's going on in the world, to understand things, right? I think like one person I talk to a lot about politics that kind of gives me a sense of like what it's like to talk to people outside of the left because I'm often in a bubble is talking to my mom about things. And my mom, when I explain things to her from a perspective that she hasn't had before, actually will be like, oh, that makes a lot of sense, like totally, you know? Um, and I think that like that's obviously not the case with everyone. This is kind of like oversimplifying, but I do think that knowledge is really important to changing the world and to changing how people think, and that um, there's like the tension between people kind of making it um like kind of like playing with this idea like oh I didn't know I'm not I like you know like playing kind of like the victim in their lack of knowledge, and I think in that sense it's like people who could have access to the knowledge who have chosen otherwise. And then there is also an active suppression that happens of either like different voices or different types of writing or different types of like revolutionary knowledge sharing that does happen. So people actively don't have access to those things. And so when they say, I didn't know, it's because there's a plan, there's the reason behind that, right? And so I'm like, I feel really strongly about the dispersing of information, both like on a personal level in the ways that it's, you know, like knowledge has changed my life, but also imagining how it can change other people's lives. And it can change like the way that we work together in this world, because at this point, we're not going to survive if we don't figure out how to work together. Um, yeah.
I think this works as a perfect connection. So I'm just going to go through those last three questions pretty quick, which is just one question for each of you from your own work, which is that because you were now speaking, I'm going to direct this to you, Tarek, which is that in your, you were speaking about lineages and access to certain things, but within layers of community and within generations, as you write pretty much very centrally in your book, The Good Arabs, there are aspects of there are certain aspects of reconciling with certain parts of there's like elitism in certain aspects of lineage, and I was gonna ask you, how do you reconcile yourself as, you know, a young, opinionated and knowledgeable person when you rub against someone who is forcing that idea of the good Arab, who is pushing for that idea of the good Arab, those epithets that come, the good Persian, the good this, the good that. How do you reconcile within that world? Because those are, we are at on the one side, we are trying to find freedoms in a larger space within the land that most of us are settlers on. And then you have this relationship with this community that is trying to bottleneck your identity into something else. I was going to ask if you could speak to that, because that is very central to your book, The Good Arabs, that came out a few years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like The Good Arabs, like just the title, but also the poem, so much of it talks about like I wanted it to kind of address multiple aspects of things, right? I think for my writing, I've always like really been into genre bending um to exploding topics to be able to cover like multiple sides of that topic, right? And so I think like for example, when people think about the good Arabs, like there's an immediate kind of like, oh, thinking about the bad Arabs, right? So then you're thinking, what does that mean? What do those things mean in relation to each other? And one thing is like this idea of like the fact that Arabs have been represented as terrorists within media and culture in the West for since 9/11, right? Since the project of everything that happened post 9/11. Um, and my intention was not to be like, I would like to now look at good Arabs, but just thinking about this idea that comes in opposition to that binary, right? You're either a good Arab or a bad Arab. What does that look like? What does that look like in the West? What does that look like in the Arab world within your communities? What does that look like within religion, right? Where a place where Christianity and Islam is very kind of interested in the idea of goodness versus badness. Um, I was thinking about it in relation to queerness, like is a queer Arab a good Arab, right? Like, um, and so I was kind of playing with like all these ideas around the word goodness and it's like obvious binary and thinking about like what it means to play in that in the middle ground, in that space. Um, yeah, and I guess like for me, I don't know, it seemed obvious to be kind of like talking about those things also in relation to like um my own perceptions of being Arab and specifically being Lebanese and the kind of like um complicity of Arab people within um like the region in which we are and the people around us who we have who like historically Arabs have also oppressed, and so thinking about the quote unquote bad colonial Arabs, right, and like what that means to have as a lineage, right, and um I think I wanted to like complicate this idea of like yeah, like who we are and how do we move past an idea of good and bad and like actually talk about like complicity and accountability and other kind of more nuanced and more important words, right? Than just like shame and culpability and um, kind of things that we get stuck in.
I think this is, again, sorry, I think a well-curated, and I'm not saying this, I didn't curate, so just so you know, the league curated this group, but a sign of a well-curated panel always shows, because when you want to ask a question from the next person, a lot has been said about that already. But I had a question for Jay about It Was Never Going to Be Okay, which is that you speak a lot about um, familiar relations, but also about like this explosion of desire. And I was gonna ask you, how do you work in relationship to desire? Because, how do you this desire that you present, and a lot of us present in this panel, is something that overrides all boundaries that has so far we've talking about taking down. There's no boundaries to what desires we experience. And what I love about your book is how all these boundaries are broken because there's all this desire within the book. And I wanted to ask you if you could speak to it a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. So that's my first book. I think, well, in both my collections, I write about desire. I write about desire in the sexual way as well. I think part of it in the first book, I wrote about desire as it being a consequence of my identity. Um, as like I am desired because I'm a fetish. I'm desired because of these things about me that I can't control is now the thing that I'm being like hunted for. And then in the second book, I kind of flip it on its head and I become the hunter. I'm like, I am being, the best way to catch a predator is to act like prey. And so I've kind of flipped that desirability where like I now desire blood. I desire flesh in the perverse way. There have been too many people who have done this want in a way that is not genuine, because there is a liberating experience in sensuality and sexuality, especially as queer trans people. There's something so liberating. And so I think for me, writing about desire is always going to be, I'm like, a dog with a bone when it comes to desirability. I'm always going to write about it, if it's what pays my bills, and it doesn't. You don't make a lot in poetry. I've been lucky enough to get a royalty check every year, so there's some privilege in there. But I think desirability, especially, we've talked a lot about censorship and some reasons why censorship happens. For me, I refuse to desexualize myself because I'm inherently a liberated sexual woman who has healthy relationships with multiple people. A polyamorous person will always introduce themselves as a polyamorous person. But I think there's something liberating to see discussions happen of like joyous takings and joyous givings. And so I think for me, I'm always going to be writing about it. I'm always going to be exploring about it. And I'm always going to be so relentlessly annoying about, especially the T for T love I get to experience. And as an Indigenous trans woman, I never thought I would be able to be gifted this love. There's so much stigma and just perceptions as like on me, and it's always like, oh, you're like, all XYZ. And it's been told my whole life, especially in foster care, that I'm unlovable, that no one will ever be able to love me. I'm so fucked up. I've got all these things that are going to get in the way. And none of that has been the true case. It's always been a conversation. And I'm always just going to be exploring it, because I think that is a symptom in which the machine wants us to quiet on. Is like, it's always this conversation about the fight and what we need to do, but also what are we going home to? Like where are we laying our head? Who are we laying it beside? Where are we taking these refuge moments? Like the heart is something to be tended to as well. And so I think for me, I'm going to fight for tomorrow, but I'm also going to fight for love. It's hand in hand. It's, one side's the palm, one side's the top of the hand.
And last question of the evening, which you actually touched upon a few times. It's really interesting, Ambrose, which is that you spoke about loving this whole idea of having a space, having a time, having a place for play. And I was going to ask you, in relationship to, we have read with each other even recently. So I was going to ask you, you often approach your writing with a playfulness that breaks a lot of, norms and boundaries that we've been speaking about. How do you see that playfulness situated against norms of literature and especially gender?
Yeah, I think they're really connected, and
I kind of approach gender in a similar way as I do when I'm writing poetry. I I like to explore. I like to try and figure things out with language or with shape. Um, and I kind of relate it to like when I was doing drag. There's so much potential there for what you're able to do. It doesn't have to look one explicit way. And when you have that freedom to explore and to again not worry about audience, my poetry is often described as oversharing. I like to call it. My family regularly joked that the first book was airing out all the family secrets. Um, and I feel like what I'm writing now is even more vulnerable and confessional, and also having that kind of freedom to let poetry be a space where I can talk about the weird things that are happening with my body on testosterone. I have a notebook I'll have with me through my recovery that's coming up, where I'll be jotting down things that come up. And that applies to community spaces too. Like I've seen so many opportunities pop up where it's not just, a writing workshop in a traditional sense where you sit around a table and the person whose piece is being written sits there quietly and listens to everyone. I've seen it be more hands-on. I've gone into high schools and done insta poetry with teens and kind of letting myself forget about those expectations and have fun and enjoy what I enjoy. So often, like, especially as queer people, we can be shamed by some of the things we write about, um, or like, oh, another coming out poem or another poem about this. It's like, write what you're feeling, write what you love, write what you hate, like use your poetry however you want to, and don't feel like you need to hold yourself back. And I think that applies in a lot of ways, again, in poetry, in life, in gender. I think there's also these expectations when you're kind of uh, on the more binary end of a transition, where you're expected, to look, in my case, like the manliest man possible. And it's like, I'm 5'3". I do my friends' makeup and hair, and I'm flowery, and I am not a macho man whatsoever. I think there's beauty in being able to experiment and not feel like gender is necessarily, one thing or the other, which I know everyone in this room, or on this panel at least, can identify with. We have freedom in that too. Um, and if we're told something's one way, sometimes we break the rules and do it our own way, which can look so unique in all of our cases.
I want to thank you, all of you. First of all, the panel. Of course, I will say all your names and the outro, but I want to thank all of you, the audience, for sticking along, because I think we got going in a way that we felt was needed to keep going, to keep needed to continue, because once we got warm, it was impossible to stop. So that brings us to today's end. I want to thank everyone for being here, for spending their Thursday night, afternoon with us, depending on where you are. And I want to thank you, Ambrose Albert, Eli Tarek Al Bishalani Lynch, and Jay Simpson. I want to thank Nick Brewer and Nicola Duffy. And I've been your host, Kess Mohammadi. Please have freedom in mind as you go from here. Read profusely, write, play, enjoy the rest of your nights. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you, Kess.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful night.
Toodles.
See you all.